I've been writing about travel for most of my life. From remote mountain villages to bustling cities, I've seen nearly every corner of the world, or at least I thought I had. That was before the invitation arrived, an opportunity to review an exclusive high-end resort, tucked deep into the heart of a jungle, far removed from the noise and clutter of civilization. It was the kind of invitation I couldn't pass up. The email had promised solitude, luxury, and the chance to experience something truly unique. A resort so private, so isolated, that it wasn't even on the map. Only the elite few were invited, and my editor had pulled some serious strings to secure my spot. The trip to the resort had been as exclusive as the place itself. I was flown in by a private plane to a small airstrip that seemed to appear out of nowhere, carved into the jungle. From there, a sleek black jeep whisked me down a narrow dirt path that cut through the thick verdant trees. The air was heavy with humidity, the dense foliage pressing in from all sides as we drove deeper into the unknown. It felt like we were traveling through a living tunnel, swallowed by the jungle's quiet, watchful presence. After what seemed like hours, we arrived. The resort was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Nestled within the jungle, the buildings seemed to rise organically from the earth, constructed of dark wood and glass, blending into the greenery as though they had always been a part of the landscape. It was breathtaking in its design, a perfect balance between luxury and nature, each structure open to the surrounding jungle, allowing the natural world to bleed into the architecture. I stepped out of the jeep, the driver giving me a nod before driving off without a word. The moment he disappeared, the silence hit me. There were no sounds of engines, no distant hum of the outside world. Just the rhythmic hum of the jungle, the faint chirps of birds, the occasional rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. I had been to remote places before, but this felt different. It felt isolated, cut off from reality. A young woman stood at the entrance to the lobby, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, a serene smile on her face. "Mr. Carter, welcome to the Silent Resort," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "We've been expecting you." I nodded, trying to shake the sense of unease that had begun to creep into my mind. I was here to write a review after all. My job was to experience the resort, take in its luxury, and describe it for my readers. The unease I felt was just the usual disorientation that came with being in an unfamiliar place. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and fragrant with the scent of tropical flowers. The ceiling stretched high above, open to the sky, allowing the soft glow of the late afternoon sun to filter in. The furniture was simple, yet elegant, made of dark wood and rich fabrics. There were a few other guests scattered about, lounging in oversized chairs, sipping drinks from delicate glasses, their conversations low and murmured. As I approached the reception desk, the woman who had greeted me stepped behind it, pulling out a small key, an actual key, not a key card, which seemed to fit the old-world charm of the place. "Everything is prepared for your stay," she said, sliding the key across the desk toward me. "Your room is at the far end of the resort, with a perfect view of the jungle. If you need anything, just let us know. We're here to make your stay as comfortable as possible." I thanked her and took the key, noticing the way her eyes lingered on me just a little too long before she turned her attention back to the screen in front of her. There was something off about the way she spoke, the way she moved. Too smooth, too rehearsed, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. But I pushed the thought aside. "Busy time of year?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Her smile widened slightly. "We keep our guest list exclusive, but you'll find the resort perfectly serene." I nodded, glancing over at the scattered guests, their faces blurred by the low lighting and the haze of relaxation that seemed to hang over the room. Something about it struck me as too quiet. But again, I pushed it aside. I was here to relax and write, not to invent problems. My room was at the far end of the resort, nestled against the jungle. The walls were mostly glass, offering an unobstructed view of the thick trees that surrounded the building. The jungle felt alive just beyond the glass, the dense foliage pressing in, as though it could consume the room at any moment. but the room itself was luxurious. An oversized bed with crisp white sheets, a sunken bath, and dark wood furnishings that gave the space a timeless elegance. I unpacked my things, setting up my laptop on the small desk in the corner of the room. I planned to start working on my first impressions of the place after dinner, but for now, I just wanted to soak in the silence. That's what struck me the most, the silence. There was no distant sound of traffic, no planes overhead, not even the murmur of voices from other rooms, just the steady hum of the jungle. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the jungle floor, I decided to head to the main dining area for dinner. The restaurant was open air, situated on a veranda that overlooked the jungle, the lights dimmed to create an atmosphere of calm and serenity. A few other guests were already seated, their faces bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. I took a seat near the edge of the veranda, the warm breeze carrying the scent of fresh rain and earth. The food was impeccable, each course carefully prepared and presented with an artistry that matched the resort's aesthetic. But despite the beauty of the setting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The other guests sat in near silence, their conversations barely audible, their movements slow and deliberate. The staff moved with an almost mechanical precision, their faces expressionless as they served the meals, clearing plates without a word. I tried to engage the waiter in conversation, but he simply nodded, his replies short and polite, his eyes never meeting mine for more than a second before he turned away. By the time dessert arrived, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The night had fully fallen by now, the jungle beyond the veranda swallowed in darkness. I finished my meal quickly, eager to return to my room. As I walked back through the winding paths of the resort, the silence felt even more pronounced. There were no sounds of nightlife, just the steady, rhythmic hum of the jungle and the crunch of gravel under my feet. Back in my room, I sat at the desk, staring out at the inky blackness of the jungle. My fingers hovered over the keys of my laptop, but I couldn't find the words to describe the place. It was beautiful, yes. Luxurious, without a doubt. But there was something else beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite put into words. Shaking off the unease, I closed my laptop and climbed into bed. As I lay there, listening to the soft sounds of the night, I couldn't help but wonder about the other guests. Why did they seem so distant? So disconnected? Sleep eventually found me, but my dreams were restless, filled with the soft murmur of voices I couldn't understand and the flicker of shadows just beyond my reach. I woke early the next morning, eager to explore more of the resort. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my camera and notebook and set off on foot to see what else the place had to offer. The jungle was alive with sound now. The calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant roar of the river. It was a stark contrast to the eerie stillness I'd felt the night before, and for a moment I felt at ease. But as I wandered the resort's grounds, something caught my attention. There were fewer people than before. The resort wasn't crowded by any means, but I could have sworn there had been more guests the previous night. The dining area, which had been scattered with patrons, was now mostly empty. Only 2 or 3 guests remained, seated at separate tables, eating their breakfasts in silence. At first I thought maybe the others had left early. It wasn't uncommon for people to check out in the morning, heading off to continue their travels. But there was no sign of any departures. No cars pulling away, no boats heading down the river. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to ask one of the staff members about it. I approached a young man who was busy clearing plates from an empty table. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "It seems quieter today. Have some of the guests checked out?" He paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Some guests leave when their stay is over," he said, his voice as flat and polite as the receptionist's had been. I frowned, but I didn't see anyone leave. No cars or boats. Did they leave another way? His eyes flicked up to meet mine for the briefest second before he turned away. "We ensure our guests' privacy," he said, his tone final. I didn't press him further, but the sense of unease I'd felt the previous night began to grow. Something wasn't right. People didn't just vanish without a trace. Later that day, I struck up a conversation with one of the remaining guests, a woman who was lounging by the pool, a book resting on her lap. She smiled as I approached, her gaze unfocused, as if she were lost in thought. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, gesturing to the chair next to hers. She nodded absently, not really looking at me. "Of course." We chatted for a while, but something about her responses felt off. When I asked her how long she'd been at the resort, she hesitated, her brow furrowing as though the question confused her. "I'm not sure, actually," she said, her voice distant. "It's easy to lose track of time here." That struck me as odd. People usually knew how long they'd been on vacation, especially at a place like this. I pressed a little further, asking if she remembered when she arrived or when she was planning to leave, but her answers became vaguer with each question. She couldn't remember when she had arrived. She didn't know how much longer she'd be staying. It was as if time had stopped mattering to her. I glanced around the pool area. There were only a couple of other guests, all of them seated alone, staring into space or murmuring softly to themselves. The sense of disconnection was palpable. It was unsettling, to say the least. I left the woman by the pool, her vague responses echoing in my head. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the growing sensation that something was terribly wrong here. It wasn't just her disinterest or forgetfulness. It was the way she seemed almost hollow, like the connection between her and reality had somehow frayed at the edges. I wandered the resort for the rest of the day, noting more of the unsettling quiet. There were no sounds of guests chatting, no laughter or friendly exchanges. Even the birds seemed quieter, the constant hum of jungle life that had been so present the day before now subdued, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The few guests I did see were much like the woman at the pool, detached, distant, their movements sluggish as though they were underwater. I tried striking up conversations with 2 or 3 of them, but the pattern was always the same. They couldn't remember how long they'd been at the resort, nor when they had arrived. And when I mentioned the missing guests, the people who had been there the night before, they simply blinked at me, confused. "Missing guests?" one man asked, his brow furrowing. He was sitting alone in the lounge, a half-empty cocktail in his hand. "I don't remember anyone else being here." "But I saw them," I insisted. "They were at dinner last night. The dining area was half full. Now it's almost empty." He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze drifting away to the jungle beyond the large glass windows. "I think you're mistaken," he said finally, taking a sip of his drink and leaning back in his chair. "It's always been quiet here." I felt the cold grip of dread tighten in my chest. It didn't make sense. I knew I'd seen more people. I had talked to them, eaten meals with them. But now it was as if they had never existed at all, and the remaining guests had no memory of them. That evening, the resort felt even more deserted. I made my way to the dining area again, hoping to find some answers, but it was practically empty. Only 2 tables were occupied, both by solitary guests who ate in silence, their expressions blank and distant. The staff, as always, moved with eerie precision, never lingering longer than necessary. As I ate, I watched the others, trying to gauge if they were as unnerved as I was, but they seemed completely unaware of the strangeness around them, as if they were trapped in their own world, oblivious to the reality I was experiencing. I decided to confront one of the staff members directly. When the waiter came to clear my plate, I asked him point blank, "Where are the other guests?" He paused, his expression unchanging. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "The guests," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "There were more of them last night. Where did they go?" For the first time, his eyes flickered with something, discomfort maybe, or irritation, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "There have been no other guests, sir," he said smoothly, his tone carefully controlled. "That's not true," I said, my frustration growing. "I've seen them. I talked to them. He gave me a polite smile and turned away, walking back toward the kitchen without another word. I pushed back from the table, my heart racing. The staff were hiding something, I could feel it. But every time I tried to get a straight answer, I was met with the same blank politeness, the same refusal to acknowledge that anything was wrong. I left the dining area, my mind churning with questions, and decided to take a walk around the resort to clear my head. The paths were eerily quiet, the once beautiful scenery now tinged with a sense of foreboding. The jungle loomed dark and impenetrable on all sides, and the flickering lights along the path seemed dimmer than usual, casting long, shifting shadows. As I walked past one of the large windows near the spa, something caught my eye. A reflection. I stopped in my tracks, turning toward the glass. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, a figure moving just beyond the reflection of my own. It was one of the guests, a woman I recognized from the previous night, walking slowly across the room. She seemed out of focus, like a smudge in the glass. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to the window, pressing my face closer to the glass, but the reflection had vanished. It had only been there for a moment, but I was certain I had seen it. She had been there, in the mirror, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. My breath came in shallow bursts as I backed away from the window, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. Something was happening here, something beyond my understanding. The resort wasn't what it seemed. The guests weren't disappearing. They were being erased. Or worse. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. The silence in the room felt suffocating now, the luxurious surroundings turning sinister in the dim light. I tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize what I had seen, but nothing added up. It was as if reality itself was bending around me, warping into something I could no longer trust. That night, sleep was a distant hope. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the jungle outside sent my nerves on edge. And then, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I heard it. A voice, faint, almost a whisper, coming from the hallway outside my room. At first I thought it was one of the other guests, maybe returning to their room after dinner. But the voice didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, repeating the same phrase over and over again. We never left. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft but clear, echoing through the stillness of the resort. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, creeping toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. But I had to know. I had to see who it was. Slowly I cracked open the door and peered into the hallway. There was no one there, but the voice continued. By the time dawn broke, I was certain of one thing. I was completely alone. The resort, once filled with staff and guests, now felt like a ghost town. I wandered the halls, the dining areas, the poolside. There wasn't a soul in sight. No polite staff members with their practiced smiles. No guests lounging by the pool or sipping drinks in the lounge. The place was deserted, as if I had woken up in an entirely different world. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty spaces, but there was no response, no footsteps, no clinking of dishes in the kitchen, no faint murmurs of conversation, just silence. I returned to the reception area, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what had happened. But the desk was abandoned. The computer screen was blank, the chairs neatly tucked in as if no one had been there in days. The stillness felt unnatural, oppressive. I wandered the resort for hours, checking every corner, every hallway, but it was as if the place had swallowed everyone whole. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of departure. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist. I stopped in front of one of the large mirrors in the hallway, my reflection staring back at me. I looked tired, disheveled, the shadows under my eyes deep and dark. But as I turned away, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. a figure standing just behind me in the reflection. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, flickering in and out of existence like a fading image on an old television screen. It was one of the guests, one of the people who had been sitting by the pool the day before. His face was blank, his movements jerky, as if he were being controlled by invisible strings. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing. The figure vanished, leaving me alone once again with my distorted reflection. As evening approached, the weight of my isolation pressed down on me. I had long since given up on finding anyone else. The resort, once so meticulously maintained, now felt like a trap, a beautiful, luxurious prison with no way out. I found myself wandering through the lounge area again, staring at the empty chairs and tables. The light from the setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the room, and I caught glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, flickers of guests and staff appearing and disappearing as quickly as I could blink. I began to notice that the few staff members I did encounter seemed to vanish the moment I looked away. I would spot one of them out of the corner of my eye, tidying a table, sweeping the floor, but when I turned to look directly at them, they were gone. I approached the bar, hoping to find someone, anyone, to speak with. The bartender, a man I had seen on my first night, was standing behind the counter, his back to me as he polished a glass. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty room. "I need to know what's going on here." He didn't respond. I moved closer, my frustration boiling over. "Where is everyone? What happened to the guests?" Still he didn't move. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but before my hand made contact, he turned, slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. His face was blank, his eyes wide and glassy, as though he were staring right through me. And then, in a low, distorted voice, he spoke. "You're alone. You've always been alone." I stumbled away from the bar, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But where would I go? The jungle stretched out endlessly beyond the resort, and the car that had brought me here was long gone. As I retreated to my room, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. The resort felt like it was collapsing in on itself, reality bending and twisting around me. I heard voices in the halls, whispers, faint and desperate, calling my name, begging for help, but when I opened the door there was no one there. Later that night, the ghostly figures returned. I watched them through the windows, their pale, flickering forms wandering the paths outside. Some of them seemed to be trying to speak, their mouths moving in jerky, broken motions, but no sound came out. Others simply stood still, staring into the darkness, as if waiting for something. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figures were everywhere now. Inside the resort, outside the windows, hovering just beyond the edge of reality. They flickered in and out of existence, their movements unnatural, like they were being manipulated by unseen hands. And then I realized nothing was real. The guests, the staff, none of them had ever been real. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The realization was deeper than that, more horrifying. The resort itself wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't just some remote luxury escape. It was something far older, something far more sinister. I felt a chill seep into my bones, my skin prickling with the weight of something watching, something ancient and malevolent. The resort wasn't a place of tranquility. It was a trap, a prison, and I had walked right into it. The guests and staff weren't illusions. They were spirits. But why? Why was I here? And more importantly, how long had they been watching me? My thoughts spiraled, the oppressive silence around me growing louder with each second. The flickers of movement I had been seeing weren't just echoes. They were them. The ones who had come before. The ones who hadn't made it out. I turned, scanning the room, the walls, the shadows. I could feel them pressing in on me. The air had grown thick, suffocating. Something was watching, something unseen but ever present. And for the first time, I knew that whatever was behind this place was no longer content with just watching. It wanted me. I bolted for the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of this room, out of this suffocating air. But as I reached the door, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted in front of me, and the handle felt icy cold to the touch. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. And then I saw them. The spirit was standing just outside my door, blocking my exit. She was the woman I had spoken to by the pool, the same vacant expression, the same distant gaze. But now her face was gaunt, hollowed out, as if drained of life. Her eyes were wide and glassy, staring right through me. But her body, it moved in that jerky, unnatural way I had seen in the reflections, like she was being controlled by some invisible force. Behind her, others appeared, more guests, some of the staff, all of them silent, their eyes locked on me, their limbs twitching with that unnatural puppet-like movement. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. I could feel the malevolence radiating from them, their collective will forcing the temperature to plummet. These were no illusions. These were spirits, trapped here, forever bound to this cursed place. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But as I moved, they moved with me. They weren't walking, they weren't floating. It was like they were being dragged, pulled toward me by something unseen. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading with. Maybe the spirits, maybe the resort itself. But the figures didn't stop. They kept advancing, their heads twitching unnaturally as their eyes followed me. The woman from the pool opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Just a low, rattling hiss that sent a wave of ice-cold fear through me. I spun around, desperate for another exit, another way out. My eyes darted toward the large windows that looked out into the jungle, but the trees seemed closer now, the jungle pressing in as though it had crept up on the resort, closing in to smother it entirely. The door rattled behind me, the spirits growing impatient, their movements more frantic. The walls seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with the weight of something watching from every direction. I could hear whispers now, faint at first, but growing louder, overlapping in a chorus of incomprehensible voices. "You shouldn't have come here," the voices seemed to say, their tones sharp and accusatory. "You were never supposed to leave." I scrambled backward, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing about this place made sense. The spirits weren't just lost souls, they were prisoners, bound here by something far darker than I could have ever imagined. I needed to run, but where? I made a break for the stairwell, my only option, the echo of my footsteps pounding in my ears. I raced down the narrow steps, barely able to see through the flickering light. But the further I ran, the more distorted the surroundings became. The walls warped and twisted, stretching like shadows in the corners of my vision. Doors opened into nowhere. The hallways looped back into themselves. It was like the entire resort was rearranging itself, trapping me in its maze. The spirits followed, their movements no longer sluggish. They were faster now, more determined. I could hear them behind me, the scrape of their twisted fingers on the walls. I stumbled, my body hitting the cold floor hard. The lights overhead flickered wildly, plunging me into moments of darkness, each flicker revealing the twisted, ghostly figures drawing closer. Their faces were pale and gaunt, eyes blackened voids. Their mouths moved silently, but I could hear their words in my head, whispers of anger, of desperation. "You can't escape," they hissed in unison. "No one ever does." I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. I could feel the cold air on my skin, the icy breath of the spirits as they closed in, their hollow eyes locked onto mine. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed into a corner, trapped between them and the endless hallways that led nowhere. But just as their ghostly hands reached out for me, something shifted. The air itself seemed to ripple, the walls warping and distorting. The spirits paused, their heads jerking in unison toward the center of the room, as if drawn by some unseen force. And then, from the shadows, something began to emerge. It wasn't one of the spirits. It was something else, something darker. The walls groaned as it appeared, a figure cloaked in shadows, its form shifting and pulsating like smoke. Its presence filled the room, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over me. This wasn't one of the trapped souls. This was something far older, the source of the evil that haunted the resort. The spirits seemed to bow in its presence, their heads lowering as the shadowy figure approached. It didn't speak, but I could feel its intent, its hunger. It was the reason the guests were trapped here, the reason this place existed at all. The resort wasn't just haunted, it was possessed, controlled by this dark, malevolent force that fed off the souls of those who stayed too long. And now it wanted me. The figure drew closer, its form towering over me, its shadow stretching across the floor like a living entity. I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my throat, even though the figure hadn't touched me. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and ragged, as I felt its will crushing down on me, pulling me toward the same fate as the others. But I wasn't ready to give up. With the last of my strength, I tore myself free from its grip, stumbling backward through the hallway. The spirits followed, their mouths open in silent screams as I ran, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to find a way out. I burst through a set of heavy wooden doors and found myself outside. The thick, humid air of the jungle hit me like a wave, but it felt colder now, sharper, as though the darkness was pressing in from all sides. The trees loomed above me, their branches twisting like skeletal arms reaching out to drag me back inside. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The path before me was overgrown, tangled with roots and vines, but it was a path nonetheless. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. Behind me, I could still hear the faint whispers of the spirits, still feel the oppressive weight of the darkness trying to pull me back. But the further I ran, the weaker their grip became. The jungle was dense, suffocating in its closeness, but I could see a faint glow ahead, something beyond the resort, something real. I pushed forward, my feet slipping on the damp earth, my vision blurring from exhaustion and fear. And then, suddenly, the trees parted. I stumbled into an open clearing, the soft light of dawn breaking through the horizon. The resort was behind me now, hidden by the dense jungle, its malevolent presence fading with each step I took. The spirits were gone. The shadow had released its grip. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The air was warm, the world around me alive with the sounds of the jungle waking up. Birds called to one another, the wind rustled through the leaves, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly alone. But I was free. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe the resort let me go, or maybe I was just lucky, but one thing is certain. I was the only one who did. The silent resort is still out there, hidden deep in the jungle, waiting for its next victim. A beautiful, luxurious trap that lures people in and feeds off their souls, trapping them in its haunted halls forever. I survived, but I'll never forget the feeling of those cold, ghostly hands reaching for me, the weight of that dark presence pressing down on my soul. But I need to forget. Some places are best left forgotten.